September 1, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The air is thick with humidity and the metallic scent of aviation fuel. Beneath the sweltering tin roof of an operations tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai's hand trembles slightly as he turns a page of the latest Allied intelligence summary. His one good eye, the other long lost to American gunners, scans a name he's never seen before, Grumman F6F Hellcat. The description makes him laugh, a heavy, clumsy brute of a plane, nearly twice the weight of Japan's sleek Zero. To the Imperial Navy's finest ace, it sounds like an American mistake. Outside, ground crews service A6M-Zeros, their engines screaming like wild creatures ready to pounce. Sakai mutters under his breath, "They think armor wins wars." Around him, younger pilots smirk, confident that the new Hellcat will be no different from the rest, slower, less graceful, another target to burn in the Pacific sky. But across the ocean, at a secret Grumman plant in Bethpage, New York, men and women work night shifts under blackout curtains, assembling something built not for elegance, but survival. Leroy Grumman, the aircraft's designer, once told his engineers, "Build me a fighter that can bring a rookie pilot home alive." The Hellcat was not born in the skies but in the wreckage of tragedy, forged from the brutal lessons of the Wildcat's defeats against the Zero. It was heavier, yes, but it could dive faster, absorb hits that would shred a Zero, and unleash 6.50 caliber guns with terrifying precision. While Japan's engineers still believed in the supremacy of lightness and agility, the Americans had shifted their philosophy, from dance to dominance. In its first combat tests, the Hellcat clawed its way through the Pacific airspace like an armored beast. It didn't just fly, it hunted. Every rivet, every thick slab of armor was a response to the blood lost at Midway and Coral Sea. At Rabaul, as Sakai folds the report and sets it aside, he doesn't yet know what's coming. Within months, his laughter will fade into disbelief. The same American machine he mocks today will soon prowl the Pacific, erasing the Zero's reign from the sky, and rewriting the very rules of air warfare forever. In the months that followed, the Pacific sky became a crucible of fire and steel. By late 1943, American carriers steamed relentlessly toward Japanese strongholds, Essex-class decks lined with dark blue silhouettes of Hellcats, each one a mechanical predator ready for the kill. The U.S. Navy called them Grumman's Iron Works, a tribute to the fighter's uncanny ability to survive punishment that would shatter any other plane. The Japanese soon learned that what they thought was a lumbering monster could climb faster, dive steeper, and shoot straighter than anything they had faced before. At dawn, above the Solomon Islands, sunlight struck the wings of the first carrier-based Hellcats as they launched into the mist. Below, jungle and ocean blurred into a single sheet of green and blue, a hunting ground. The Japanese radar screens lit up with blips. Zeros rose to intercept, confident, graceful, and impossibly light. They spiraled into the fight with decades of samurai tradition in their blood, the spirit of Bushido soaring with each maneuver. But the old rules no longer applied. When the Zeros closed in, the Hellcats didn't turn and dance. They dove, straight down, engines screaming, letting gravity and horsepower do what agility could not. The first dogfights were brutal lessons in shock. Hellcat pilots, often fresh from training, discovered their aircraft could take hits that once spelled certain death. Japanese bullets thudded into armor, but the engines kept roaring. In seconds, the Americans rolled back, climbed hard, and struck from above, the classic boom and zoom tactic, perfected now by machines that could absorb chaos and return it tenfold. Pilots like Lieutenant Alex Vrashu and Butch O'Hare carved their names into the Pacific legend, downing multiple Zeros in single sorties. By the end of 1943, the once invincible A6M-0, the pride of Japan, was meeting its equal not in maneuver but in momentum. Each engagement revealed a truth Japan had not prepared for: the Hellcat didn't fight fair. It fought smart. And in this new era of air combat, the elegance of the samurai sword was being crushed beneath the relentless hammer of American industry and tactical evolution. The age of the Zero was cracking, and the Pacific winds began to carry the sound of a new empire's roar. By early 1944, the skies over the Central Pacific were no longer arenas of equal contest, they had become slaughterhouses. The Hellcat, now fully integrated into every major carrier group, reigned supreme in the vast blue expanse from the Marshalls to the Marianas. Each takeoff from a rolling deck was a symphony of thunder, Pratt and Whitney engines roaring like caged beasts released into war. The Japanese still launched Zeros, but their pilots were no longer veterans, they were students, barely trained, flung into the storm to defend an empire already bleeding. American intelligence had learned every secret of the Zero's performance. Through captured aircraft and meticulous testing, they discovered its fatal weaknesses, fragile construction, poor armor, and an engine that could not sustain steep dives. The Hellcat was built to exploit them all. Its pilots no longer needed to fear the once superior turning radius of their enemy, they knew how to break contact, climb, and return with a vengeance from above. In the air, that knowledge translated into dominance. The most haunting proof came during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, wave after wave of Japanese aircraft surged toward the U.S. fleet near Saipan. The Americans intercepted them at high altitude, their radar-guided formations locking onto targets long before the Japanese could even see the enemy. Hellcats dove in packs, precision, discipline, and sheer firepower overwhelming every trace of Bushido courage. The radio chatter crackled with calm voices, not panic. By sunset, more than 300 Japanese planes had fallen. The U.S. lost fewer than 30. The sea below was littered with wreckage, floating reminders of an empire's fading power. Survivors who made it back to their carriers stared silently into the horizon, their victory overshadowed by the sheer brutality of what they had witnessed. Above the Pacific, it was not just aircraft that burned. It was an idea, that spirit alone could triumph over steel. The Hellcat had proven otherwise. It wasn't beauty or grace that ruled the sky anymore. It was resilience, firepower, and a new kind of pilot, one who fought not for glory, but for survival in a war where mercy had long vanished from the clouds. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots after the Marianas campaign was devastating. Reports recovered after the war revealed an air force spiraling into despair. The once proud sons of the Imperial Navy, trained to believe in spiritual supremacy, began to understand that no amount of willpower could outfly steel and science. In hidden diaries found among the wreckage of downed aircraft, young aviators wrote of metal demons that could not be stopped, machines that climbed through fire, shrugged off bullets, and struck from impossible angles. The Hellcat had become more than a fighter, it was a phantom of inevitability. In Rabaul, Truk, and Tinian, the skies that once echoed with the sharp cry of the Zero now roared with the heavy growl of Grumman engines. Japanese commanders tried to reorganize their air defense, scattering squadrons and conserving their dwindling fuel supplies, but it was too late. The Americans controlled the tempo, dictating when and where the war would be fought. Every intercepted transmission, every radar blip, every fading contrail in the distance reminded Japan that they were now reacting, never initiating. For the Americans, the transformation was equally profound. The Hellcat turned farm boys and factory workers into aces overnight. Pilots who had never seen combat before found themselves shooting down seasoned enemy flyers, not through luck, but through design. The F6F had been engineered to forgive mistakes, to turn fear into confidence. Its wide wings could pull out of deadly dives, its cockpit armor could stop cannon shells, its engine could limp home even when half dead. It was a machine that refused to die, and that refusal became the spirit of its pilots. By 1945, Japan's skies had become graveyards of aluminum. The once feared Zero, light, elegant, almost poetic in its creation, now appeared fragile and doomed against the blunt force of industrial warfare. Japan had built its legend on the myth of invincibility, the Hellcat shattered it in less than a year. And as factories in the United States rolled out one new aircraft every hour, Japan's production lines stood silent, strangled by blockade and bombing. The war of courage had ended. The war of endurance had begun. In the ruins of Japan's shrinking empire, something darker began to emerge, desperation disguised as devotion. By mid-1944, the Imperial High Command realized that conventional air combat was lost. The Hellcat's dominance had erased any illusion of parity. Outnumbered, outgunned, and technologically outmatched, Japan turned to a weapon born from despair, the kamikaze. It was not a tactic of strategy but of surrender, a final attempt to inflict terror when victory had already vanished from sight. The first kamikaze attacks began in the Philippines. Hellcat pilots, who had once battled the Zero in open skies, now found themselves facing men who no longer intended to return home. They dove straight into ships, their engines howling like banshees, carrying bombs fused to ignite on impact. The Americans were stunned, not by the destruction, but by the resolve. Yet even here, the Hellcat adapted. Flying as interceptors, they formed protective screens above the fleet, engaging suicide planes long before they reached their targets. Radar-guided, faster, and more heavily armed, the F6F became the last line between the fleet and annihilation. From the cockpit, the sight was surreal. Pilots described watching enemy aircraft disintegrate midair, pieces of burning fuselage tumbling into the sea. For every kamikaze that broke through, dozens were cut down before reaching the ships. The Hellcat's 6 Browning machine guns shredded the attackers, yet each kill carried no triumph, only the grim understanding that the man inside had chosen death long before takeoff. The Pacific sky had turned from a battleground into a graveyard of conviction. By war's end, the statistics were staggering. Hellcats accounted for 75% of all aerial victories achieved by the U.S. Navy, more than 5,000 enemy planes destroyed. It was the highest kill ratio of any naval fighter in history. But behind those numbers lay something far more haunting, a war that had evolved beyond men and machines into something elemental. The Hellcat had not just defeated Japan's air force, it had crushed the very soul of its martial identity. And in doing so, it marked the beginning of modern, mechanized air supremacy, the age where courage alone could no longer win a war. As Japan's skies dimmed under the shadow of defeat, a quieter battle raged in the hidden corners of intelligence and engineering, one few ever saw, and fewer survived to tell. Deep within the naval research compounds of Yokosuka and Nagoya, Japanese engineers dissected fragments of downed Hellcats with surgical precision. They traced the rivets, studied the armor thickness, weighed the engine mounts, desperate to understand how such a clumsy-looking machine could dismantle their proudest creation. Secret reports recovered after the war revealed a haunting realization: the Hellcat is not faster than the Zero, one engineer wrote, but it is eternal. Japan's scientists tried to replicate what they saw, drafting blueprints for heavier, more durable fighters, the Kawanishi N1K George and the Nakajima Ki 84 Frank. But the Empire's factories were in ruins. Bombing raids by B-29 superfortresses had reduced production to ashes. Resources that once fed innovation were now scavenged from wreckage. In underground bunkers, engineers worked by candlelight, surrounded by the constant tremor of distant explosions. The once proud empire of aerial craftsmanship was dying beneath its own perfectionism. Meanwhile, in the United States, the assembly lines in Bethpage, New York, operated with machine-like rhythm. Day and night, thousands of workers, women in bandanas, teenagers too young for the draft, rolled out Hellcats faster than Japan could shoot them down. Grumman's philosophy was brutally simple: build, fly, replace. If one fell, 10 more would rise. In this industrial onslaught, the balance of the Pacific was no longer measured in skill, but in steel and sweat. Captured pilots later told interrogators that they began to fear the Hellcat not as an opponent, but as a presence, an inevitability. When we saw that silhouette, one Zero pilot whispered years later, we already knew we were dead. The aircraft's thick wings, blunt nose, and thunderous engine became symbols of unstoppable force. For the Japanese, the sky, once a place of honor and beauty, had turned into a cage. And within that cage, the Hellcat circled endlessly, silent and merciless, the embodiment of an empire's reckoning written across the clouds. In the final months of the Pacific War, the air itself became a weapon. The Hellcat, once a guardian of the fleet, now served as the vanguard of annihilation. Each mission pushed deeper into Japan's heartland, each sortie another hammer blow against a nation already burning from within. From the decks of carriers off Okinawa and Iwo Jima, waves of F6Fs launched daily, sweeping aside the last remnants of Japan's air defense. The few surviving Zeros that rose to meet them were ghosts, obsolete relics in the face of a machine born from adaptation and rage. Below, entire cities disappeared beneath the roar of engines. Firebombing raids turned night into day, the horizon glowing red with the embers of what had once been civilization. The Hellcat's machine guns and rockets strafed airfields, convoys, and communication lines, choking Japan's arteries before the final blow could even fall. It was warfare stripped of illusion. There was no longer chivalry, no longer a contest of equals. The skies belonged entirely to one side. American pilots, many barely 20 years old, described flying over Japan as watching the end of an age. What they saw below, shattered railways, empty runways, smoke rising from cities that no longer had names, was the death of an empire that had once believed the sky itself was sacred. Some pilots wrote later that they no longer felt triumph, only a heavy silence when they landed. The Hellcat had given them victory, but it had also shown them the terrible cost of it. As the tide of war approached Tokyo, Japan's remaining command staff ordered a final stand, Operation Ketsugo, a desperate defense of the homeland. But even as they prepared, the outcome was already decided. American radar networks stretched across the Pacific, carrier fleets ringed Japan like vultures, and above it all, the F6F Hellcat ruled the air without rival. For Japan's airmen, each sunrise brought the same realization: they were no longer fighting for victory, only for remembrance. The battle that had begun with laughter at Rabaul was ending in smoke and silence. By summer 1945, the Hellcat's shadow stretched from Okinawa to Tokyo Bay. It had become more than a machine of war, it was the physical manifestation of American inevitability. Every sortie was part of a rhythm of destruction that had no pause. Japanese resistance in the air had vanished. Their pilots now flew obsolete aircraft on one-way missions, their fuel tanks half-filled, their radios dead. The Hellcat pilots often found themselves circling above empty skies, their guns unused, the enemy already extinguished before contact could even occur. In those final missions, the Pacific seemed endless and eerily quiet. Pilots described it as flying over a world already dead. Smoke rose from the mainland, black columns stretching high into the stratosphere, carrying the last breath of a nation that once sought dominion over the same skies. The Hellcat squadrons escorted bombers over Yokohama and Nagoya, watching from above as fire consumed everything below. What had begun as a contest of machines had turned into an act of unmaking, precision replaced by annihilation. Captured Japanese officers, interrogated in the final weeks before surrender, spoke with disbelief about the scale of American power. "We were defeated by factories," one said, "not by men." They weren't wrong. Every rivet of the Hellcat, every round fired from its 6 Brownings, was a piece of an industrial colossus that Japan could never hope to match. Its air force had fought with honor, but honor could not stand against mass production and material science. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, 1945, the skies were filled with Hellcats patrolling in silence, circling over a defeated empire. Pilots who had once been farmhands and factory workers looked down on cities they had only known through briefings and newsreels, now reduced to ruins. The Hellcat had not just won air superiority, it had ended an era. The same machine that began as a desperate response to early American defeats had become the silent witness to Japan's collapse. The laughter at Rabaul, once mocking and confident, had long since vanished. In its place, only the sound of engines idling over ash and surrender remained. In the aftermath of Japan's surrender, the world's attention shifted to the ruins of the Pacific, but within hangars and intelligence offices, a quieter reckoning began. Teams of engineers and analysts from the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces poured over the remnants of Japan's once feared air fleet. They documented everything: the Zero's delicate frame, the superior maneuverability achieved through fragile construction, the lack of armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. What they discovered confirmed what the Hellcat's victories had already proven: Japan's brilliance had been trapped in an old philosophy. They had built machines for duels of honor, the Americans had built machines for the brutality of reality. In a warehouse near Yokosuka, American intelligence officers examined captured Japanese war records. Among them were flight logs and personal diaries from downed pilots. One notebook, belonging to a 19-year-old airman from the 343rd Naval Air Group, contained a single line written days before his final mission: "The Hellcat cannot be defeated. We fight only so the world remembers that we tried." Those words spread through American intelligence circles, a haunting echo of the cost of pride and faith meeting the cold precision of engineering. Back home, many Hellcat pilots struggled with the silence of peace. The aircraft that had made them legends was now being dismantled, scrapped, or sold for training. The Pacific aces who had once felt invincible returned to farms, factories, and quiet towns. For them, victory carried a strange emptiness. They had survived the deadliest aerial war in history, yet the ghosts of their opponents, the faces glimpsed only in split-second combat, followed them long after. Some wrote memoirs years later, confessing that their admiration for the Zero pilots never faded. They respected their courage, even as they destroyed them. The war's numbers told one story: the Hellcat's unmatched kill ratio of 19-1, its dominance in every major battle, but history held another, more human truth. The skies over the Pacific had not been won by hatred, but by evolution. It was the story of two worlds colliding, craftsmanship versus mass production, faith versus physics, and in that collision, the world learned that victory in modern war belonged not to the most spiritual, but to the most adaptable. When the war ended, the F6F Hellcat, the brute once mocked as too heavy, too slow, too crude, faded quietly into history. But its legacy lingered in every jet and carrier that came after. The lessons it taught were written not just in manuals, but in blood. It had proven that wars were no longer won by the fastest or the most daring, but by the one who could endure, adapt, and return home. Beneath its armor and firepower lay the soul of a machine built for survival, and in that, it reflected the nation that made it. In post-war Japan, the silence that followed surrender was filled with rebuilding, reflection, and loss. Veterans who once soared through blue Pacific skies now walked through shattered streets. The imperial airfields that had birthed the Zero lay in ruins, overgrown with weeds and scattered with forgotten fuselages. Engineers who had once designed the most graceful aircraft in the world found themselves studying American textbooks, absorbing the science that had defeated them. From that humility would rise a new Japan, one that built not weapons, but technology that would reshape the world in peace rather than war. For the Americans, the Hellcat became a symbol of transformation, the moment when courage met technology and together forged dominance. Its pilots had faced death with steady hands, their confidence not in superiority, but in trust in a machine that refused to fail them. They had outlasted an enemy that began the war with arrogance and ended it with ashes. The laughter that had once echoed at Rabaul had become a ghostly memory, drowned out by the roar of the Hellcat's engines. Even decades later, veterans would recall the sound, deep, rolling, indestructible, like thunder announcing a storm that would never end. The F6F Hellcat was not just a plane, it was a turning point in human history. It ended an era where honor could defy progress, and ushered in one where survival was the only truth left in war. Its victories were written across the Pacific sky, not in triumph, but in remembrance, a monument of steel to all who fought, laughed, and vanished beneath the endless horizon.